Hey there, third graders. Today we are going to be reading chapters 23 and 24 of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. When we left off, there were only 3 of our lucky winners left. We have Charlie Bucket, our main character. We have Veruca Salt, who is kind of the rude one, who's like, Daddy, I want that, I want it now. And her dad had the peanut factory, and that's how they got the golden ticket, because they stopped working in the factory and had them all open candy bars. And then there's Mike TV, who loves watching TV. Last name's perfect for him. And he has the toy guns strapped around him. And when we left off, they were going to enter the room where it had square candies, like the square, that looked round. We're going to find out how that is possible. So, chapter 23, Square Candies That Look Round. Everybody stopped and crowded to the door. The top half of the door was made of glass. Grandpa Joe lifted Charlie up so that he'd get a better view. And looking in, Charlie saw a long table, and on the table there were rows and rows of small white square-shaped candies. The candies looked very much like square sugar lumps, except that each one of them had a funny little pink face painted on the side. At the end of the table, a number of Oompa Loompas were busily painting more faces on more candies. There you are, cried Mr. Wonka, square candies that look round. They don't look round to me, said Mike TV. They look square, said Veruca Salt. They look completely square. But they are square, said Mr. Wonka. I never said they weren't. You said they were round, said Veruca Salt. I never said anything of the sort, said Mr. Wonka. I said they looked round. But they don't look round, said Veruca Salt. They look square. They look round, insisted Mr. Wonka. They most certainly do not look round, cried Veruca Salt. Veruca, darling, said Mrs. Salt, pay no attention to Mr. Wonka. He's lying to you. My dear old fish, said Mr. Wonka, go and boil your head. How dare you speak to me like that, shouted Mrs. Salt. Oh, do shut up, said Mr. Wonka. Now watch this. He took a key from his pocket and locked the door. It flung open, and suddenly, at the sound of the door opening, all the rows and rows of little square candies looked quickly round to see who was coming in. The tiny faces actually turned toward the door and stared at Mr. Wonka. So those faces on the candies looked around. Get it? There you are, he cried triumphantly. They're looking round. There's no argument about it. They are square candies that look round. By golly, he's right. Come on, said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. On we go. We mustn't dawdle. So before I continue reading, here's those square candies with the faces. And it's not that the square candy looks like it's a circle round. It's square candies that are looking places, looking around. So it's kind of a play on words. It's tricky. So now they're running back down the hallway, or the corridor. Butterscotch and buttering, it said on the next door as they passed. Now that sounds a bit more interesting, said Mr. Salt, Veruca's father. Glorious stuff, said Mr. Wonka. The Oompa Loompas all love it. It makes them tiddly. Listen, you can hear them in there now whooping it up. So that means they're like talking loudly, screaming, giggling. Shrieks of laughter and snatches of singing could be heard coming through the closed door. They're drinking butternut scotch and soda. They like that best of all. We really mustn't keep stopping like this, he said. He turned left, then turned right. They came to a long flight of stairs. Mr. Wonka slid down the banisters. The 3 children did the same. Mrs. Salt and Mrs. TV, the only women now left in the party, were getting very out of breath. Mrs. Salt was a great fat lady with short legs, and she was blowing like a rhinoceros. This way, cried Mr. Wonka, turning left at the bottom of the stairs. Go slower, panted Mrs. Salt. Impossible, said Mr. Wonka. We should never get there in time if I did. Get where? Said Veruca Salt. Never you mind, said Mr. Wonka. Just wait and see. So we're looking for that next room. Let's find out. Chapter 24, Veruca in the Nut Room. Who do you think is going to be the next one to get in trouble? Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. The nut room had set on the next door that they came up to. "All right," said Mr. Wonka. "Stop here for a moment and catch your breath, then take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the nut room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels." Everyone crowded around the door. "Oh, look, Grandpa, look!" cried Charlie. "Squirrels!" shouted Veruca Salt. "Jeepers!" said Mike TV. It was all an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. "These squirrels are specially trained for getting the nuts out of walnuts," said Mr. Wonka. "Why use squirrels?" Mike TV asked. "Why not use Oompa Loompas?" "Because," said Mr. Wonka, "Oompa Loompas can't get the walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of a walnut shell every time. It is extremely difficult, but in my factory I insist upon using the whole walnut. Therefore I have to have squirrels to do the job. Aren't they wonderful, the way that each gets a nut out? And see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's not a bad one? If it's a bad one, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the garbage chute. There, look! Watch the squirrel nearest us. I think he's got a bad one now." So here's the squirrel. And what the squirrel does is it grabs the walnut and it taps it. And if it makes a hollow noise, he knows it's a bad nut. And he tosses it and it goes down the garbage chute. If he knocks it and it's not hollow, it's a good nut, and he'll crack it open. So that's kind of what they're describing there. They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckle. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently. Then suddenly he threw the walnut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. "Hey, Mummy!" shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. "I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels." "Don't be silly, sweetheart," said Mrs. Salt. "These all belong to Mr. Wonka." "I don't care about that," shouted Veruca Salt. "I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel." "All right, my pet," Mrs. Salt said soothingly. "Mummy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can." "But I don't want any old squirrel," Veruca shouted. "I want a trained squirrel." At that point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. "Very well, Wonka," he said importantly, taking out his wallet full of money. "How much do you want for one of these crazy squirrels? Name your price." "They're not for sale," Mr. Wonka answered. "She can't have one." "Who says I can't?" Veruca Salt shouted. "I'm going in to grab me a squirrel this very minute." "Don't!" said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small, black, beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Her gaze then fell on a pretty squirrel sitting nearest to her on the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. "All right," Veruca said, "I'll have you." She reached out her hands, grabbed the squirrel. But as she did so, in that first split second when her hands started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the corner, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. Remember, there's 100 squirrels in this, and they all jump and land on Veruca's body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 caught a hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 caught a hold of her right leg and anchored that down. And 24 caught a hold of her left leg. So there's 25 on each arm, 25 on her right leg, and 24 on that leg. So we're just missing one squirrel. And the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up on her shoulder and started tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckle. "Save her!" screamed Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her?" "They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels kept hold of her tight. She couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder kept tapping on the side of her head with his knuckle. Then, all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, she is a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. "Her head must have sounded quite hollow." Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws that held her in place she couldn't escape. "Where are they taking her?" said Mrs. Salt. "She's going where all the other bad nuts go," said Mr. Wonka. "Down the garbage chute." "By golly, she is going down the chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. "Then save her!" cried Mrs. Salt. "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "She's gone." And indeed, she had. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. "What happens to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly into the great big main garbage pipe, which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory, all the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbage and fish heads and stuff like that." "Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know," said Mike TV. "I do, of course," answered Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cocoa beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the great big pipe go in the end?" "Why, to the furnace, of course," Mr. Wonka said calmly. "To the incinerator." An incinerator is like a room or a box, not made out of cardboard, but like metal, that gets so hot that it has like flames and it burns everything instantly in there. So if she's getting sent to the incinerator, it gets burnt up, she'd be gone. And he's just casually like, "Oh, to the incinerator." Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. "Don't worry," said Mr. Wonka. "There's a chance that they've decided not to light it today." "A chance?" yelled Mrs. Salt. "My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like sausage." "Quite right, my dear," said Mr. Salt. "Now, see here, Wonka," he added. "I think you've gone just a shade too far on this. I do indeed. My daughter may be a little bit of a frump, if I don't mind saying, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I really am. Cross means he's upset." "Oh, don't be upset, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka. "I expect she'll turn up sooner or later. She may not have gone all the way down. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole. And if that's the case, all you have to do is go in and pull her out again." Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and run over to the hole in the floor and peered inside. So there is the mom freaking out because her daughter just got thrown down a garbage chute and could be going to the incinerator to be burned. Here's the dad who's like, "I'm rather upset about this." And here's Mr. Wonka who, if you can see, still has a smile on his face. Now they both run into the room to try and save Veruca. "Veruca!" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Are you down there?" There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only a tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place. And that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled in the hole, head first, screeching like a parrot. "Good gracious me," said Mr. Salt as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hall. "What a lot of garbage there's going to be today." He saw her disappearing into the darkness. "What's it like down there?" he called out. He leaned forward. So the wife leaned over this hole, and the squirrels gave her one little gentle push, just like a little poke, and she fell down the hole. And the husband's like, "Oh man, what's it like down there?" And now here he is, peering over the hole, and look what's coming behind him. The squirrels rushed up behind him. "Help!" he shouted, but he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. "Oh dear!" cried Charlie, who was watching with the others to the door. "What on earth's going to happen to them now?" "I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute," said Mr. Wonka. "But what about the great fiery incinerator?" asked Charlie. They only light that every other day, said Mr. Wonka. Perhaps this is one of the days that they let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky. Shh, said Grandpa Joe. Listen, here comes another song. From far away down the corridor came the beating of the drums, and then the singing began. Here is Oompa Loompa song for Miss Veruca Salt. Veruca Salt, sang the Oompa Loompas. Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the garbage chute. And as we very rightly thought, that in a case like this we ought to see the things completely through, we've polished off her parents too. Down goes Veruca, down the drain, and here perhaps we should explain that she will meet, as she descends, a rather different set of friends. To those that she has left behind, those won't be nearly so refined. A fish head, for example, cut this morning from a halibut. Hello, good morning, how do you do? How nice to meet you, how are you? And then a little further down, a mass of others gather round. A bacon rind, some rancid lard, a loaf of bread gone stale and hard, a steak that nobody could chew, an oyster from an oyster stew. Some liverwurst so old and gray, one smelled it from a mile away, a rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left on the stairs. So these are all the things that are in the garbage chute that her family's having to encounter. And lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell, a really bad smell. These are Veruca's newfound friends that she will meet as she descends, and this is the price she has to pay for going so very far astray. But now, my dears, we think you might be wondering, is it really right that every single bit of blame and all that scolding and the shame should fall upon Veruca Salt? Is she the only one at fault? For though she's spoiled, and dreadfully so, a girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need? Who turned her into such a brat? Who are the culprits? Who did that? Alas, you didn't look so far to find out who these sinners are. They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, Mum and Dad. And that is why we're glad they fell into the garbage chute as well. That's the end of that chapter. So the Oompa Loompas are saying she was a horrible person, she was spoiled, she was mean, and she's going to make friends with all these garbage and stinky stuff because that's what she deserves. They're like, but she's not the only one to blame for her actions. She wasn't the one who made herself into the way she is. Her parents are actually to blame. So they're like, it's a good thing. We're happy her parents fell because they deserve it. They spoiled her and they made her into this monster, basically. So that's what the Oompa Loompas were saying. We are now down to 2, Mike TV and Charlie Bucket. Those are our last 2 ticket winners. Everyone else has done something they shouldn't have done and has gotten a huge consequence. I mean, Augustus Gloop was sucked up the chocolate chute. And Violet Beauregard turned into a giant blueberry and she'll forever be purple. And now Miss Veruca Salt and her parents fell down the garbage chute and could possibly be burned in an incinerator. So they've all done something. They touched something. They didn't follow directions. They broke a rule, which led to them having some big consequence. And we're going to find out more that happens. The next one, chapter 25, is called The Great Glass Elevator, and you'll have to wait for the next video to watch that. Let me know if you need any help. Do the comprehension questions in the other video, and keep up the fantastic, marvelous, wonderful, amazing work. Bye.